say hello. Thank you all so much for coming tonight.
Thank you so much, Precious. What a great group tonight. You're really hardcore. You came out on a Tuesday night to talk about the super statutes, right? That are colliding. And so we're thrilled to have you here. Really grateful to Precious and Angelina for helping make this possible to be here at Manny's tonight. We also want to make sure this is interactive, and we're going to pass around the microphone after Professor Elmendorf makes his presentation so that we can have dialogue and discussion. But for those who'd like to use the Slido app, we'd also like to try that. You should have gotten a QR code in your email reminder for tonight's event. If you don't have that though, we do have the QR code available on tables around the room. Also, the number is 272-5851 if you do have the Slido app, 272-5851. We'll make sure that if you don't want to, say your question out loud, I can grab those too and make sure that Professor Elmendorf received those. But it's been a real pleasure to work with Chris on state legislation and really to bring his experience and knowledge to bear on a pro bono basis. SPUR is very grateful for that work, and we're trying to solve this housing crisis and really address both the Housing Accountability Act challenges vis-a-vis CEQA. We had legislation we ran last year with Assemblymember Ting, and we do plan to bring that back to really address not just the 469 Stevenson Street example, but just in general how jurisdictions can now use CEQA to try to get around the Housing Accountability Act, because we spent the past several years strengthening that statute in the legislature. So I don't want to take up any more time than that and have Professor Elmendorf come up, make the presentation. We're excited to be in dialogue with you tonight. So thank you very much.
All right, it's great to be here. Michael and I started talking about putting together a little talk on this topic, and said, "Hey, would you like to do a Zoom presentation?" I'm like, no. I do so many Zoom presentations. I'm so sick of it. I'd like to go someplace where I can be with people. So it's really, really nice to be here with people. And we are trying to add a little technology aspect to this through the Slido app. I was at a conference a month or two ago in which the app was used for questions and comments. And actually, it was like a weird technology thing that worked really well because people could see each other's questions. And so if I say something that doesn't make any sense or you want some clarification on, just like pop the question in the app, and if a bunch of other people like it, then Michael will know to like cut me off, and I'll answer the question and we'll continue. So I thought I would talk for maybe half an hour, 45 minutes. I have a presentation put together. But again, I'm happy to take questions as we go, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A as well, and come and go, get food, leave, come back. I won't feel offended any which way. We do have some, sounds like an ocean. You're the ocean? All right. Okay, so I'm going to cover three territories during this presentation. One is the theory of accountability problems or accountability deficits that underlay respectively the California Environmental Quality Act, which was passed in 1970, and then the Housing Accountability Act, which was passed a dozen years later. We will see that these theories are in some tension with each other, and then that tension becomes acute once these laws get applied in practice. After the Housing Accountability Act came to be greatly strengthened through recent amendments. And we'll see that come to a head in the case of the Stevenson Street project in San Francisco. So I'll talk about that project, what the fight was, how it then went through the courts, and what the San Francisco Superior Court recently decided. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about potential solutions to the conflict. I'd also like to acknowledge Tim Duncan, who's here today. Tim and I wrote a paper about this together, which will be coming out in the Ecology Law Quarterly from Berkeley sometime soon, I think. All right. So the accountability deficit. As I said a moment ago, CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, and the HAA, which is short for the Housing Accountability Act, they were both responses to what were perceived to be significant accountability problems. But they approached their respective problems in ways that turn out to be contradictory with one another. So CEQA. Here is then Governor Ronald Reagan signing CEQA into law in 1970. Think about California in 1970. What had happened in the generation leading up to 1970? Well, we built freeways. We built dams. We bulldozed neighborhoods and cities. We built a lot of things and we caused a lot of problems in the process. And there was a sense that we were building these things without knowing what we were doing to the environment in the process. And the public had a right to know, and indeed some right to participate in generating the knowledge about what kinds of environmental effects these projects would have before the government undertook the project. That was the problem that CEQA set out to solve. And while CEQA is often described as a statute that is meant to protect the environment, and it is a statute that is meant to protect the environment, its theory of how it would protect the environment is fundamentally about providing information to the public so that the public could hold their elected officials responsible for, accountable for the environmental effects of their decisions, right? So this is a now like kind of plain vanilla statement from the California Supreme Court about what CEQA does, right? What it's supposed to do. It's supposed to inform the government and the public about proposed activities, environmental impacts, identify ways to reduce environmental damage, require project changes via alternatives or mitigation when that's feasible, and finally, disclose to the public the rationale for governmental approval of a project that may significantly impact the environment. Okay, that's the key part, the fourth. Disclose to the public the rationale. Yes?
Has this understanding of CEQA changed over the years? Like, is it evolved? This like little statement here, is it dated to a particular time?
Well, this is a 2015 decision, but the ideas go way back to the early 1970s. So in fact, in the next slide here, we have a statement from the California Supreme Court in 1974. Only by requiring the county, in this case, the county was the defendant, to fully comply with the letter of CEQA, will the public be able to determine the environmental and economic values of their elected and appointed officials, thus allowing for appropriate action come election day should a majority of the voters disagree. So somehow, through the preparation of that environmental impact report, as it's called, that study of project alternatives and the expected environmental effects of choosing the project versus choosing one of those alternatives, somehow that's going to help the public see what the environmental values of their elected officials are, and then the public can hold the government accountable if it doesn't like what the government is doing, the values that it is revealing through its choices. Another key idea from CEQA, just a moment, let me get this one out. Another key idea from CEQA that ties into this theme of public accountability is that when a project is being undertaken by a local government, by a city or a county, it is the elected officials of that local government who are ultimately responsible for CEQA compliance. So the elected officials may be able to delegate certain decisions to the planning commission or to the planning department, as the case may be. But if the planning commission or the planning department approves an environmental clearance, that approval has to be appealable to the elected body of the local government. Again, so that the people, the residents, can hold their elected officials accountable for the environmental values that they express. Yeah. Yes.
Economic, a kind of little hole for which a lot of people have used to broaden and get more involved in CEQA.
So a project that is found to have a significant environmental effect may be approved, notwithstanding that significant environmental effect. But CEQA says the elected officials have to make what's called a finding of overriding consideration. That there's some other value or some other obligation that is more important than the environmental harm that the project would cause. But again, this is a finding that's supposed to be made by the elected officials, and then the people can hold those officials accountable. Okay. So CEQA was signed into law in 1970. What did the 70s bring us? Well, the 70s brought us a big change in development patterns in California. They also brought us a big change in housing prices in California. So this is a figure from a report of the legislative analyst that shows the median home value in California relative to the median home value in the United States as a whole from 1940 to 2015. And if you go all the way back to 1940, California is in the dark blue, the US is in the light blue. California's always been a little bit more expensive, which isn't a big surprise. Like, California's got great weather. California's a nice place to live. We're all here for a reason. Some of us maybe because we're born here, but many of us, including myself, moved here from somewhere else, and we like it, right? There are many attractive things that make people want to live in California. And so it's not surprising that California has, for a long time, been at least a little bit more expensive of a place to live. However, between 1970 and 1980, something really dramatic happens. And California home prices go from being maybe 20% more expensive than the median home in the rest of the country to being 100% more expensive, to being twice as expensive. And that pattern of California being at least twice as expensive as the rest of the country persists up to the present day. But the legislature responds to the escalation in home prices. And part of its response, maybe the centerpiece of its response, comes in 1980 with the enactment of what's called the Housing Element Law. And the Housing Element Law sets up this really complicated conveyor belt for meeting, or hopefully meeting, regional needs for housing. There are elements of this law that actually go all the way back to the 1960s, but it's in 1980 that it sort of takes on the form that it more or less continues to have to this day. How does it work? Well, the state or state agency quantifies at a regional level how many new homes are going to be needed over the next 8 years. Regional councils of governments, which you can think of as being like a little UN for local governments. Each local government sends its ambassador to the regional councils of governments, and then they get together. And what do? Well, one of the things they do is they divide up transportation responsibilities, but then they also allocate these regional determinations of housing need to each of the local governments within the region. So each local government gets a housing target. The local government then adopts what's called the housing element of its general plan for land use, which is supposed to show how it will accommodate its share of the region's need for housing. That housing element is then submitted to a state agency, the Department of Housing and Community Development, or HCD, for review and approval. And then finally, assuming HCD approves the housing element, the local government then revises its zoning ordinances to conform to the housing element. So the housing element would typically say, or was expected to typically say, that local government had to do some rezoning to accommodate additional housing. And that rezoning has to be done within 3 years of adoption of the housing element. Okay, so that's the scheme. It's kind of Rube Goldberg-y, but we're plowing ahead with it. And then 2 years later, the legislature's like, oh, wait, we got to do something to make sure that once the local governments rezone, they actually approve the projects that are consistent with the local government zoning. And that's where the Housing Accountability Act comes into play. And its function is just to block what you can think of as backdoor downzoning, right? There's a project that's proposed on a site that's been zoned for that kind of project. And the local government's like, oh, well, yes, our zoning said you could build that there, but really we've changed our mind. And we've got some other reason to deny it now. And so as originally written, the Housing Accountability Act is this really short statute, 3 short paragraphs. It says, when a proposed housing development project complies with the applicable general plan and zoning standards that were in place at that time, but the local agency proposes to disapprove it or to impose a condition of approval that would require it to be developed at a lower density, the local government has to make 2 findings. 1, that the project would have an adverse effect on public health or safety, and 2, that there's no feasible method to mitigate or avoid that impact other than disapproving the project or developing it at a lower density. Very, very simple idea. Okay. So the HEA moves along. It's amended from time to time by the legislature. It grows, it changes in certain ways. But over the last 4 or 5 years, it changes dramatically. It's really transformed, and it takes on a new life starting in 2016. So what does the legislature do? Well, it adopts some new findings. First, that our intent in enacting the HAA originally was to curb the capability of local governments to deny housing, and that intent has not been fulfilled, right? We haven't achieved what we wanted to achieve. If you go back to that figure of housing prices, to the extent that this Housing Accountability Act in conjunction with the Housing Element Law was supposed to bring us back to something more like the pre-1970 world, it didn't work. So legislature says our intent has not been fulfilled. So going forward, the legislature provides an instruction to courts. This statute shall be interpreted and implemented in the manner to afford the fullest possible weight to the interest of housing. Okay. We also get, beyond this exhortation, a new definition of what it means for a housing project to comply with a city's general plan and zoning standards. And this is truly revolutionary. So for context, let's say you have a somewhat fuzzy or ambiguous or disputed regulatory standard. And a project comes before an agency and they approve the project or they deny the project according to this standard, and someone challenges the agency's decision in court. The universal answer across umpteen different areas of law is if you want to challenge that agency's decision, you need to show that it was crazy, that given the evidence before the agency, nobody could possibly agree with the agency's decision. The HAA, as it's amended, turns that idea on its head. And the new rule under the HAA is that if any reasonable person could agree that the project complies with the local government's rules, then it complies as a matter of law. In other words, the old rule was, when in doubt, if there's any smidgen of doubt about whether the project complies, courts must defer to whatever the local government decided. Whether it approved the project, whether it denied the project, courts defer to the local government. The new HAA rule is the local government gets no deference at all. If there's any room for doubt about whether the project complies, then it does comply as a matter of state law. Furthermore, a city has 30 to 60 days, depending on the size of the project, to give written notice to the developer of any general plan or zoning standard with respect to which the city thinks the project does not comply. And if the city fails to provide that notice, or if the city leaves something out of the notice, the project is deemed to comply as a matter of state law with the standard in question. So this is a massive transfer of authority from city councils to planning staff. Because who's making those 30 to 60-day determinations, if anybody? It's staff. And if the staff screws up and fails to send out that letter, or if the staff thinks that a project complies with the standard and so it doesn't bother to mention possible non-compliance with the standard in that letter, game's up. Project complies as a matter of law. City council may disagree with staff determination, but unless the city council has a way of making that disagreement known within 30 to 60 days of the time the developer submitted the application, city council's out of luck. Now, there's still the health and safety exception, right? So the city council, if it's a health and safety standard, the city council can absolutely second guess the staff decision. But if it's just a question about, you know, is the project of the right height or the right design or the this or that, you know, the kind of ordinary bread and butter stuff of land use and development standards, the determination now rests with staff rather than the city council. Third, we got a bunch of new remedies. So one maybe familiar one is that if someone challenges the city's denial or reduction in density of a project from the HAA and they win, the city has to pay the prevailing party's attorney's fees. That's not that unusual. There are a lot of provisions that of law that require cities to pay attorney's fees to people who sue them, but no other provision of law, to my knowledge, requires a city to pay a developer's attorney's fees, right? That's kind of unusual. Second, something that is really unusual, a court can order a project approved. And that might not seem that weird, but again, this is a big departure from background principles of administrative law, state and local government law. The normal thing a court does when it finds that a government agency screwed something up is it says, you messed up, do it again. Make that decision again. Reconsider your decision, give us a new justification, and then we'll review your new justification. The HAA is different. The HAA says, in the normal case, a court gives the city 60 days to reconsider its decision in light of the court's order, and the court retains jurisdiction, so it's monitoring what the city's doing. But further, if the court finds that the city acted in bad faith, the court's job is just to order the project approved, not to send it back to the city. Another thing really unusual about the HAA remedially is if a city's denial of a project is challenged in court and the city loses in the trial court, that is the first level of the judicial system, and the city wants to appeal its loss, the city thinks the trial court messed up, the city has to post a bond so as to compensate the developer for losses the city would incur, or the developer would incur, if the city appeals and loses on appeal. Right? And developers are paying interest to their investors, right? So like time is money for the developer, right? Time is almost never money for a project opponent, but now time is money for a project opponent or for a city if they're appealing a trial court's decision against them. Finally, courts can fine cities if they fail to comply with a court order, and those fines are multiplied if the city was in bad faith. And the initial response to this strengthening of the HAA from a number of cities was, no way, you can't do that. That's got to be unconstitutional. Like, surely there's something in the California Constitution somewhere that says you can't do that. And indeed, the city of San Mateo pursued a so-called home rule challenge. The city of San Mateo is a charter city, and under the California Constitution, any city that wants to become a charter city may do so by incorporating itself with a vote of the city's residents as a charter city. San Francisco is a charter city as well. And charter cities do enjoy some protection under the California Constitution for what are called municipal affairs, things that are sort of uniquely the concern of the city. And San Mateo argued, well, land use, that's a classic municipal affair. Cities are in the business of regulating land use. That's our job. It's not the state's job. And so they challenged the constitutionality of the HAA in court. And the California Court of Appeal in the San Mateo case resoundingly endorsed the HAA's constitutionality and also overturned the denial of the project that was at issue in that case and established a really important precedent going forward. And there have now been a number of other judicial decisions that read the HAA quite broadly following that legislative exhortation. Okay, so that's the HAA in a nutshell, and you've got CEQA in a nutshell. They're both solving different or purporting to solve different accountability problems. One, voters not being able to tell the environmental values of their elected officials, and maybe elected officials not even realizing the environmental consequences of their decisions. And the other, cities' accountability to their region, right? Ensuring that each city is doing its fair share towards the regional need for new housing. So there's a conflict, though, a pretty big conflict between these two laws. And I want to describe the main points of conflict and then show how they come to a head in the case of the Stevenson project. So let's start with the premises of CEQA and the HAA and the points of conflict between them. So first, virtues of local political discretion over housing. From the point of view of CEQA, local political discretion is great, right? We want the local elected officials to have discretion over projects, and in particular to have discretion over the terms of the environmental review and the decision about whether to approve the project following the environmental review, because that is how the city's voters are going to hold them accountable for their revealed environmental values. The HAA says, on the contrary, local elected officials' political discretion over individual housing projects is a disaster, right? Or at least it has to be very tightly curtailed, which is exemplified in this by this norm, right? That planning staff make the decision about whether a project complies with applicable standards, and once they make that decision, it's binding on the city council. Whereas, yeah. Oh, elaborate on bad faith. So the HAA defines a bad faith decision as one which is in bad faith, comma, frivolous, or otherwise clearly without merit. So, or maybe it says bad faith includes decisions that are frivolous or otherwise clearly without merit. So bad faith, you might think connotes like maybe a desire to like enrich yourself as a city council member rather than to follow the law, or something really devious, but the HAA actually describes it a little more broadly to and in a more objective sense to mean a decision that is clearly without merit, like not a you can kind of argue it both ways type decision. Okay, so really different ideas about whether local political discretion over projects is a good thing. That's one point of conflict. Second point of conflict is the virtues of deliberation versus speed. So the basic mantra of CEQA is slow down, right? Don't make hasty development decisions. We made too many of those between 1945 and 1970, so we need to do it differently going forward. And I can go into various details about how CEQA expresses that slow down idea, but there are many. Eventually the legislature did add some timelines to CEQA. It wasn't part of CEQA initially. They're added in 1977. But courts ultimately say those timelines are unenforceable. They're just advisory because the overriding purpose of CEQA is to ensure that decisions are careful, that they're made only after doing an appropriately fulsome environmental study. And so at any timeline that would interfere with the completion of such a study is unenforceable in court. The HAA, by contrast, its message is exactly the contrary: speed up. The HAA incorporates by reference another law called the Permit Streamlining Act, which is supposed to set enforceable timelines for project approval. And indeed, there are many aspects about the entire housing element framework that are tied to a clock that has specific actions that have to be taken by specific dates with penalties if they are not taken. Let's see, I think I may have just lost. Oh, okay. A third point of conflict between the two. Oh, now I've lost both. You got music? Let's see. Okay, yeah.
It's like fun when people know your Wi-Fi password because it makes it like anyway, hey, hi, hello, welcome back to my screen.
So yeah, sure. No, that's a good question, but the answer is no. And the problem is that we have no way of knowing what the counterfactual is, right? CEQA applies everywhere. If the legislature said, okay, we're going to flip a coin and we're going to randomly exempt half of California cities from CEQA, well, then we could figure out like what the effect of CEQA is on housing production. But all we really have are anecdotes from people who are in the trenches, or as we'll see, ways of in which other laws are made to depend expressly on the completion of CEQA studies. Yeah. Sure.
We know what percentage is used for housing like development sites versus like dams or roads.
Yeah, so CEQA's there are studies that have been done on like what share of CEQA cases are now about housing, and let's see, was Will Sterling here? Do you have that off the top of your head? It's a lot. Yeah. Which is not to say that like the typical housing project faces CEQA litigation. Only a very small percentage of housing projects, like maybe 3%, face CEQA litigation. But the entire approval process is structured around like, how do we avoid the CEQA litigation? So the costs are there, they're just built in up front. Okay, so deliberation versus speed. The last thing about like major conflicts between the laws, like their views about the status quo, right? So CEQA's assumption is that if so long as you don't change the status quo, there's nothing to worry about. In fact, the clearest manifestation of this in CEQA is that if there's a denial of a project, you don't have to do any environmental study to justify the denial. Denials are presumed to be benign. Only when you're approving a project, you have to do an environmental study. Whereas the HAA actually now includes a finding of the legislature that the lack of new housing in cities and infill areas causes sprawl, undermining the state's environmental and climate objectives. So status quo is benign for CEQA, malign for the HAA. So at the level of like premises or values, those are the points of conflict. But now let's look at how that conflict plays out in the context of an actual project. So this is the Nordstrom or Stevenson Street project in San Francisco. It was a proposal to put 500 homes, a rather large apartment building, on a site that's currently used as valet parking by Nordstrom's. It's a block from the nearest BART station. It's in the priority development area under the region's climate plan. It's as good a place for housing as you will find anywhere in California. But it's a big project in a neighborhood where some people don't want more big projects. And so the developer did what developers always do, which is go meet with the community or meet with whoever is organized in the community and try to hash out a side deal, something called a community benefits agreement, where you promise money or jobs or affordable housing units or any other kinds of good things that you might be able to come up with to leaders of local interest groups, in return for which the leaders of those local interest groups agree to endorse your project, to turn out their members at public hearings about your project, and hopefully, get it sailing through the approval process. And that's what the developer did in this case. And they managed to get 11 or so different community groups on board with their project. They signed the community benefits agreement. But one group remained adamantly opposed. This is the so-called Todco group led by John Elberling. And Todco said, this deal, this community benefits deal, it's not good enough. What I want you to do is to donate a third of the site to the city so they can land bank that for some future affordable housing project when there's money for it. And then develop a smaller project on the rest of the site. And the developer said, no, I'm not going to do that. I've already signed this community benefits deal with a bunch of other groups. That's enough. I'm going to go forward with the project. And so Todco appealed the approval of the project, and it was appealed up to the Board of Supervisors, and the Board of Supervisors somewhat unusually voted to disapprove the project, even though the representative of that district where the project was proposed, Matt Haney, was in favor of it. And afterwards, some of the supervisors spoke to the press. Melgar said Haney should have negotiated a deal between the developers and Todco, right? The person who was appealing the project to the board said, I'm not cool with the existing community benefits agreement. I've got this other proposal. Melgar said, yeah, you should have worked out something with them. That was her view. Mandelman says, if this is actually able to become a 100% affordable project in the future, I will feel very good about this vote. If that doesn't happen in 15 years from now, it's the parking lot, well, then I won't feel so good. Okay. So those are the public statements. Now let's talk about the nitty-gritty, like the legal nitty-gritty of what happened. The city could not impose Todco's scheme as a condition of approval. The city, that is, couldn't say, we're going to approve your project if you donate a third of the site to the city and build a smaller project on the other 2/3. Why couldn't the city do that? Well, it'd probably be unconstitutional under the federal constitution, but beyond that, under the HEA, that would be a condition of approval that reduces the density of the project. And you can only impose that density reducing condition of approval if you can find it's necessary to prevent a health or safety violation. And there's no argument that building the project as proposed would violate some objective health or safety standard that was in effect at the time the project was proposed. Okay, so that's something the city just could not do. So instead of doing that, instead of overtly violating the HAA, the Supes just said, we're going to send the environmental study back to the planning department for what? More pages. Make it bigger, make it longer, do additional studies. It's already 800 pages, but we want to see 1,600. No, that wasn't exactly what they said. They said, we want to see more analysis of historic resources, more analysis of gentrification impacts, and more analysis of the foundation. Now, if you want me to explain in the Q&A why these were completely frivolous arguments under CEQA, I can, but for now, just take it for granted that they were frivolous, legally frivolous arguments. They absolutely could have approved the EIR right there. Yes, Todco might have sued, but if Todco had sued, the city would have won in court. Now, last piece. Neither CEQA, at least as it's been construed by the courts, nor any background principles of administrative law provide a remedy for delay. So the city can't do what it wants to do under the HAA, which is impose this condition of approval that makes the project smaller. But the city can, through CEQA, say, we want more studies. And how much more studies? For how long will you continue doing more studies? Will it be 15 years as Mandelman suggested, or maybe only 10, or could it be 25? I don't know. That's the problem. Like, is there any remedy? And if so, from where? Now, YIMBY Law, a local, I don't know if there are any YIMBY Law people here, but a local pro-housing group sued and said, God, there's something that's got to be wrong here. There's something that's got to be illegal here as well as wrong. Their lawsuit was resolved by the San Francisco Superior Court's CEQA judge about a month ago. Senator Scott Wiener wasn't really pleased with the judge's ruling, but let's dig into it, like what the court actually had to say about this. Was there a violation of the HAA? Nope, said the court. Why not? Well, there can't have been. It's formally impossible for there to have been a violation of the HAA, because the HAA only disallows disapprovals and conditions of approval that reduce density, and a city cannot disapprove a project until it's finished its CEQA review. So there couldn't have been a HAA violation. Well, what about another theory the YIMBY Law group tried out? There's this other law called SB 330, passed in 2019, Housing Crisis Act. It says there's only supposed to be 5 public hearings, no more than 5 public hearings on a housing project. And there had already been something like 7. So the plaintiff said, well, surely this violates SB 330. Nope, said the court. At this juncture, CEQA review is still in process. Also, there's a bunch of like rhetoric in the opinion about how CEQA really likes hearings, and SB 330 doesn't mess with CEQA. But regardless, CEQA review is still in process, so we can't adjudicate your SB 330 claim. We can just throw cold water on it in what lawyers call dicta, which is just extra words that's not essential to the decision. Maybe the Permit Streamlining Act is at issue here. No. And here the court was clearly right. The clock, the timeline for project approval under the PSA only starts to run when the CEQA review is done, and CEQA review is not done. Well, maybe there's a violation of CEQA itself. No, nothing in CEQA authorizes a court to direct a public agency to exercise its discretion in any way. And as yet, no final EIR, that is environmental impact report, has been certified. And because no EIR has been certified, the cause of action, the challenge to the CEQA study is not yet ripe. That's a technical legal term, meaning sweet and ready for a judge to eat or decide, as the case may be. And finally, though, yeah, there are those CEQA time limits, but they are directory, that is advisory, not mandatory. So there we are. Yes.
So was this whole mess, was that you, or is that a precedent that started somewhere else?
So some of this is new and some of this is old, right? So the idea that time limits under CEQA are not usually enforceable in court, that's pretty old. At least there's some old decisions that say if a developer cooperates with the city past the timeline, the developer can't enforce the timeline. The PSA decision was clearly correct as the statute is written. The SB 330 decision was new, and the HAA decision was new. So it's a mix of new and old.
So the YIMBY people managed to completely destroy their own case just by bringing this court case, when in retrospect they would be better off not bringing it.
Well, you can argue that different ways. So let's talk a little bit about what might be done now. What solutions are in the offing? So One possibility is to appeal the Superior Court's decision to the Court of Appeal. There have been some good decisions recently from this Court of Appeal that would hear the appeal. Tim Duncan and I argue in this paper that I think we both think there's a pretty good argument, or at least plausible argument, that at least a denial of a CEQA clearance, a CEQA approval that is in bad faith is an HAA violation itself. And the record here is pretty great for trying to show bad faith. Both the supervisor's decision was objectively frivolous, and indeed that their intent was not to gather additional environmental information, but to block the project. And for whatever reasons, like that argument, I don't think was fleshed out quite as well as it might have been for the Superior Court, and maybe that could come back and ultimately be a winning argument on appeal. There are also some other arguments that we discussed in this paper that I think are a little more of a stretch. Maybe that the HEA, through legislative exhortation and these strengthening amendments, somehow by implication transform CEQA in a way to make the CEQA timelines enforceable, so that a court could order an environmental study certified if the time for completion of the environmental review has passed and the environmental review is in fact legally adequate. Or maybe bad faith decisions are themselves reviewable simply because of the bad faith. But I think the strongest argument is that it was in fact an HAA violation, even though the HAA has a savings clause that says nothing in the statute shall be construed to absolve a city from its duty to comply with CEQA. That savings clause doesn't allow the city to abuse CEQA to achieve exactly what the HAA was supposed to prevent. Beyond the courts, there are potential legislative solutions. One that Michael alluded to earlier, a bill that SPUR developed and member Phil Ting ran during the last legislative session I advised on. And I think this bill had a really elegant solution. Basically, what it proposed, how it would work, is that after the CEQA deadline is passed, a developer may call the question of whether the draft CEQA document is in fact legally sufficient. It's an option. The developer doesn't have to use the option, but it's an option. And once the question is called, the city has 90 days to make up its mind. If the city then fails to act, or if it votes or decides to require further study when the environmental review was in fact sufficient, that would be defined as a violation of the HAA. And the HAA remedies, including an order approving the project, would then be available. Local governments were concerned that this would put cities in kind of an impossible position where they're sued if they approve the project or they're sued if they deny the project. And there's a legitimate concern there. And so one of the things the bill said was that if a city is in good faith and it's sued by anybody, the plaintiff doesn't get attorney's fees, whether it's sued by a project proponent or project opponent. To get the fees, you need to show the city was in bad faith. And finally, this would only apply to dense housing on infill sites. So great bill, I think. I hope it comes back. It made it all the way through the Assembly and through all the policy committees of the Senate, only to be killed an ignominious death in Senate Appropriations, which is a peculiar California legislative occurrence that Michael can talk more about if you're interested in it. And then finally, maybe there's some hope, although I think less hope, for administrative solutions through the housing element update. So San Francisco is about to adopt its new 8-year housing plan. And as part of that housing plan, the city has to analyze and remove constraints to new housing. There's no definition of constraint in the statute, which makes this a little messy. But certainly an abusive CEQA process is colloquially a constraint, and failure to comply with timelines is maybe closer to being legally a constraint as well. So maybe the state housing agency, HCD, can force the city to take some action to deal with the CEQA process. But it's pretty tough for HCD to say whether this is a systematic problem in any city, because CEQA is unbelievably complicated, and HCD can't simply audit city CEQA decisions. It doesn't have the resources to do that. HCD's authority to insist on particular corrective actions is also pretty limited. But San Francisco is a special case, and HCD has launched what it is calling the Housing Policy and Practices Review of San Francisco, which it has done for no other city, which is going to be sort of like a 1-year checkup, a kind of intensive visit to the state housing doctor. And maybe through this intensive inspection, there will be some kind of reform to local CEQA processes, but I'm not counting on it. I have much higher hopes for the legislative fix. So thank you so much. Get some food, some drink, and questions. Oh, sure. Yeah, yeah.
First, what is Taco have the influence it has? Why does Taco have the influence it has?
Well, they put a lot of money into politics. They run affordable housing projects that use federal housing vouchers. And the way the federal housing voucher program works is that the amount of money that owner of the project gets is tied to market rents. So market rents in San Francisco have been going up pretty dramatically over the last generation. Todco had a bunch of projects, and it's not building new projects, but it keeps refinancing its existing projects because it gets higher rents as the rents go up, and then plows that money into ballot initiatives. It can't actually give that money to supervisors for their campaigns because it's a nonprofit, and that would violate federal tax law. But it can, as a nonprofit, put money into ballot measure campaigns. And as some of you probably know, ballot measure campaigns can function effectively as money for supervisor, because everything gets bundled together into a slate mailer, and then the ballot committee puts money into the slate mailer, which is tantamount to giving money to the supervisors. So they put a lot of money into elections where supervisors are on the ballot, and I imagine that is probably why they're influential. But maybe I'm just a cynic.
Great. Here's another one. Why was 469 Stevenson Street a CEQA project in the first place? Was it because current zoning ordinance that didn't permit this housing in the zone as of right?
So every housing project in San Francisco is a CEQA project. And the reason for that is there is a provision in the San Francisco City Charter, which has been construed by the courts, was construed by the courts in 1980 or something like that, to give the city full discretion over any permit issued by any city department. Technically, it's the Board of Permit Appeals that has that discretion, but in practice, it's now exercised by the supervisors and by the Planning Commission, by all kinds of other agencies. So what this decision means is that the San Francisco City Charter has been construed to make every law that authorizes any form of development advisory on the permitting agency. And the permitting agency always has discretion to decide, well, in this case, I don't think your project is a good idea. Or in this case, I want to impose some new condition in the public interest. And the trigger for review under CEQA is the existence of discretion. And so under the city charter, discretion is conferred on all permits. And thus CEQA is always an issue. The one caveat to that is that there was a bill authored by Senator Wiener some years back that said if the city's not making adequate progress towards its housing targets, then certain projects become ministerial, that is automatically approved if they comply with objective standards as a matter of state law. And so that has created a new subset, a narrow subset of non-discretionary projects in San Francisco, but so far the only projects that qualify are those that are 50% low income. So it's only a relatively small segment of the housing market that's affected. Sorry, that's probably more detailed than you wanted.
You've mentioned the concept of a super statute. What makes CEQA a super statute?
That's a great question. So I didn't mention that concept in the talk, but it is in the paper that Tim and I wrote. And the idea of a super statute is that even though there's no like formal distinction between different kinds of statutes, I mean, the statute is a statute is a statute. They're all the same, except for those that are adopted by initiative. That's a weird California quirk. In practice, some statutes come to be regarded by the courts as really important big deals. We'll just call these the BFD statutes or the super statutes, and they get construed broadly when there's ambiguity. And other statutes are regarded as like little deals, and they get construed narrowly when they bump up against the super ones. And so just as a descriptive matter, CEQA since the early 1970s has been treated by the California Supreme Court and thus by lower courts as a statute that should be construed in the broadest possible way. And that has then engendered a bunch of decisions that kind of elbow out of the way other laws like the Permit Streamlining Act. The HAA absolutely didn't have that same super characteristic until this last round of reforms from 2016 to 2019 that really, just as CEQA in the 1970s established kind of a new way of thinking about like the job of government and how it should be carried out. The HAA does a very similar thing with respect to housing. And just as the courts announced that CEQA would be construed broadly in the interest of CEQA-ness, the legislature through the HAA has announced that the HAA shall be construed broadly in the interest of housing.
So I'm going to bundle three questions here around housing element and builder's remedy together. So first, does housing element actually have any teeth to it? Two, is the builder's remedy part of the 2019 HAA legislation? Is that the same term for the remedies that were discussed? And then finally, can you situate the builder's remedy that I'm seeing in the headlines into what you've just presented?
Yes. Okay. All really, really great questions. First, does the housing element have any teeth to it? Yes, I think it does. Will ultimately be the one to find out. He's a lawyer who is in the trenches of this business, but for many years, the housing element was a paper pushing exercise, but this round is really, this update that we're going through now is really different. Why? Well, one, the targets are much, much higher than they've been in the past. So this is going to push cities to do rezoning, which they haven't had to do much of in the past. Second, there's a new requirement that cities affirmatively further fair housing through the housing elements, which means providing opportunities to build multifamily housing broadly in lots of places across the city, not just in the Mission, or not just in a small number of traditionally disadvantaged neighborhoods. And that's pushing cities to rezone in neighborhoods where they traditionally didn't touch. And then finally, there are provisions both in the housing element law and now in the HAA that say if the density of a project is consistent with the density proposed in the housing element for the site, the local government can't use its more restrictive zoning to deny the project or to require it to be developed at a lower density. So that to some extent alleviates the problem with cities adopting their housing element, but then never doing the rezoning that they were supposed to do to conform to their housing element. Second, builder's remedy that's been in the headline. How does it relate to all of this? Builder's remedy was not part of the 2016 to 2019 legislation. Builder's remedy is like a really old, archaic, old as in circa 1990, addition to the HAA that said, if a city is not in compliance with the housing element, then the city cannot use its zoning code or general plan to deny or to render infeasible an affordable housing project. And an affordable housing project is defined as one which is 20% low income or 100% moderate income. So the units have to have deed restrictions that limit the rents or the price at which the units can be sold. But if a project is affordable, it has these extra protections under the HEA, and the most dramatic of which is the protection that applies if the city is not in compliance with the housing element law, namely the city can't use its zoning code or general plan to disapprove the project or to render it infeasible. So in theory, the city's out of compliance with the housing element law. It's like no zoning for those 20% low income projects. Now you might say like, well, this has been around since 1990 and it's like, why am I hearing about it now? And the answer is, as best I can tell, it was used once between 1990 and 2022. And that was in 1992 when a homeowner in Albany who had an unpermitted accessory dwelling unit decided that they wanted to get their accessory dwelling unit permitted. And they went to the city and asked for permits, and the city said, you need to provide 2 off-street parking spaces for your accessory dwelling unit. And the homeowner was like, what? I can't do that. And plus, you don't have a housing element. So you can't apply your parking requirements to my accessory dwelling unit. And the city planner was like, well, parking requirements are needed for health and safety. So they made a health and safety finding, which is a permissible ground under the HEA for denying the project, and the homeowner didn't have the resources to sue. Now, the way the health and safety exception is written in the HEA now, it's incredibly narrow. There's no way that that move would fly today. But I think the real reason why there weren't any builder's remedy projects for so long was that the only way that you could make money as a developer was to be in the good graces of the city councils and the planning commissions where you did business. Your special sauce as a developer was your relationships. Maybe you were just a good guy. Maybe you were passing money under the table, but it was all about the relationships. And so proposing a project that a city doesn't want to approve, right, that doesn't comply with zoning was a bad idea from a business perspective, even if it was allowed under the law. But through the HEA's recent amendments that make it much stronger, through laws like SB 35, which I mentioned, through laws like, most dramatically, AB 2011, the Buffy-Wicks bill that passed this last legislative cycle that upzones major road corridors for multifamily mixed-use housing. There's now an opportunity for developers to get projects entitled on the basis of their knowledge of their rights, as opposed to on the basis of their relationships. And so I think you're starting to see the emergence of a new kind of developer whose comparative advantage is not their relationships, but knowing their rights. And what's so interesting about the now poster child for the builder's remedy, which is this set of 16 projects that are pending in Santa Monica, is that most of those projects were proposed by like the biggest builder in town. Right? It was not like a fly-by-night, like tech guy or something who's proposing this project, or some random homeowner trying to get an ADU entitled. It was a big institutional player who's like, these are good projects. I'm gonna propose them. I'm not gonna worry about burning bridges. So I think you're gonna have to approve them at the end of the day. And also, like, I think the tides are turning, and my proposing these projects isn't going to be the death knell of my business, and we'll see if they turn out to be right.
And I would just say that's the thing about discretionary decisions. We're not based on objective standards. It comes down to relationships, and the potential for corruption is always there when it's everything is just at the whim of a majority on a city council to approve or not approve a project. Chris, you won't be surprised by this question if it's a follow-up. How does CEQA impact the builder's remedy?
I think everybody who sat through this talk knows the answer, which is that any city that doesn't want to approve a builder's remedy project is going to use CEQA to delay it and delay it and delay it and delay it and delay it. And ultimately, the courts are going to have to decide whether delay forever is in fact permissible, or the legislature is going to have to decide whether delay forever is permissible. And I think one way of understanding the Santa Monica projects is that some developers are betting that the law is going to change.
So 2 years ago, I woke up here in San Francisco.
Thanks, Michael. So 2 years ago, I woke up here in San Francisco and it was noon and the sky had turned red. You know, and the skies were red all day, and I was walking around in the mask because out of control wildfires, which had been sparked in part by climate change, had turned the sky red, right? And I was really disappointed that CEQA hadn't seemed to work, right? It's like, we've had this law since 1970 and the environment has not been protected, right? So it seems like local control means losing control under the status quo, right? So what I'm wondering is, suppose we thought about a fundamental rewrite of CEQA. Like, what would you do if you wanted to say, okay, most Americans agree that climate change is the challenge of our time, right? So what if we rewrote CEQA to say, we're going to reach our goal of a climate neutral economy? You know, what would that look like? Because what we've got, the problem of course is that if you're a local planner, you're like, yeah, requiring 2 off-street parking spaces is good for keeping the local curb from getting overcrowded. But we all know from the research that at a national and global scale, that just worsens climate change, right? And it's the same thing with blocking 469 Stevenson. So how can we rewrite CEQA to make it work for solving climate change?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and it's a generational project, right? And you can I think raise the same question about CEQA's parent, which was the National Environmental Policy Act, adopted a year earlier by Congress. And while NEPA is in some particulars not quite as harsh as CEQA, it's the same basic idea. And there are real questions about how the Inflation Reduction Act, AKA Green New Deal, right? AKA, you know, most important climate legislation ever, is going to be implemented in a world where any local rando who's upset about a new transmission line or solar panel has the ability to go to court and delay it through NEPA litigation. So I think this conversation is one that's going to be happening both at the California level and the national level for at least the next decade, and probably for much longer than that. Because while I could give you an answer about how to rewrite CEQA and NEPA and remove the assumption that, for example, the status quo is benign and a project is bad, there are so many interest groups that have congealed around or now use these statutes to serve non-environmental objectives, some of which you might say are laudatory objectives and some of which you probably would say aren't. But there's so many interest groups out there now that changing these laws is really hard.
Thank you for your presentation. I've been around a long time, and this is the first time I've heard anyone pull all these things together. So it's I'm glad I came. You know, we have in San Francisco a cadre of people who do not want to build things, whose intention is to keep property empty unless affordable housing can be built. And they are experienced, shrewd, as you pointed out, have resources, and have been doing this for a long time. They torpedoed the hub plan. They've done a variety of things for the last 10 or 15 years. The guy with the glasses behind your elbow is John Eberling on that mural. I've been telling Manny he needs to get a new mural, but he is the eminent Grease because he has that TADCO resources. But my question is, so the state does their study and, you know, they find that San Francisco has all these problems, but many of them come from, you know, this group, and one of their strategies, of course, is to show up at the last minute with a whole lot of issues and confuse people. So people say, even the supervisors say, oh, well, I don't know, let's put it over. You know, if the state comes in and says, you know, part of the problem is your local people, how do we get around that?
That's a good question. And I think one way we get around that is through project approval processes that don't rely on public hearings and don't create permitting discretion with respect to projects that comply with the rules in place at the time the project is proposed. So I am suggesting that state law is already changing the city charter or preempting the city charter in part. So SB 35 does that for some projects, not many, because they have to be 50% affordable now. But if in 4 years, it may be projects that are 10% affordable. That will depend on a renewal of SB 35 and how the city is making progress towards its housing targets, but it could potentially be much broader. AB 2011, that's the Buffy-Wicks bill, makes ministerial a bunch of projects on transit corridors or commercial streets and near transit stops. The housing element rezoning has to provide for by right development of 20% low income projects on rezone sites, as well as sites that weren't developed in the last housing element cycle. So we're going to see, like, in bits and pieces, a kind of carve outs from that charter discretionary review model. And how broad that is and how politically sustainable that is remains to be seen. But I think the question of whether it's politically sustainable is ultimately going to depend on the composition of the state legislature and the attitudes of the governor rather than on the board supervisors.
Over here. You said that the state doesn't have the resources to look at CEQA implementation across all the municipalities. I guess I want to question that. I mean, working across municipalities, the state could require reporting that would show pretty good data on the better and worse faith actors across the entire state. Timelines, you know, reasons for objections, things like that, that would start to really show who's trying and who's not.
Yeah, I think that point's well taken. And right now the state requires EIRs to be filed, but not exemption determinations. Some exemptions have to be filed, but not others. And so the state is only seeing like a little piece of the picture. But if you want to put together like the model reporting statute, I think there's somebody in this room who might be willing to work with you on a bill.
Hi. So I just have so many questions, and hopefully I'll be able to ask them sometime. But the one that I really want to land on is kind of this idea of the state taking over distributing entitlements. So, you know, you already see through the Housing Accountability Act, like a court could issue permits. There are other venues where, like, you know, the cities are obligated to issue permits, but it seems like a lot of the changes at the margins are going to kind of give courts more discretion to, you know, act as the planning or building department, well, the planning department.
Yep.
But at a higher level, should those efforts kind of be more coordinated so that it's not the courts that become the statewide planning department, but maybe, you know, something with a little bit more like administrative expertise?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really great question. And I have my doubts about the HAA model. And, you know, I think it's worth trying. It's better than what we were doing previously. But an alternative to the HAA would just be to create a state permitting agency and give developers the option of going to the city if they want to get their entitlement, or going to the state if they want to get their entitlement. And then cities would still have some degree of local control if they were able to say, you know, hey, look, we've got a great permitting environment here. Come get your permit from us. We'll work out a deal where we get some community benefits or some other things, but we're also able to do these really nice things. And we're operating on a really fast timeline, and we know we have to because we're in competition with this other permitting agency. Like, that might be a much, much, much better model. And it wouldn't require courts to do things that are radically different than courts have ever done before. They would still be reviewing city and state decisions in the normal deferential way, letting the agencies make up their minds and do their things. It's just the developer would have the option of going to a different permitting entity. But that's a bigger administrative lift to stand up a new agency. And it's also relative to just, you know, amending the Housing Accountability Act, giving some additional rule to courts. And I think there would be, as much as there has been local government pushback against the HAA, there would be a lot of local governments that are pretty upset about a new state agency that was issuing entitlements. But I like the idea. I'm sympathetic to it.
Totally out of the picture with housing now, but let's fantasize somehow decide to get back in that business. Is it the same problem as CEQA or NEPA or any of these things going to stop everything?
Well, CEQA wouldn't apply to a decision of the federal government. So if the federal government wanted to get in the housing permitting business, like, it could do it on its own without complying with CEQA. NEPA would potentially be an issue. But I guess I have even less hope that the federal government will assume that role than that California might create some kind of state permitting agency, which does actually seem to me very much within the realm of possibility.
A lot of the rays of hope that you have outlined seem to be related to projects with pretty high affordability requirements. Are developers like chomping at the bit to do those projects, or are we going to have to wait until the rays of hope are like more market rate before we see like real change?
That's a really good question. I think certainly, like, the builder's remedy stuff, it all requires substantial affordability. The HAA, the basic HAA protections do not. Right, the basic Housing Accountability Act protections apply to all housing development projects, regardless of affordability. And in that sense, the HAA is to some extent, maybe you say just like a product of an earlier legislature, right? It's been strengthened recently, but when it was adopted initially, the idea was to protect all housing projects. And many of the other legislative efforts we've seen more recently through the density bonus law or through like AB 2011, SB 35, they're focused much more on projects with a substantial affordability component, which means in practice, they only protect housing development where housing is already way too expensive. Because it's only in those places where housing is already way too expensive that a developer can do the cross subsidies, right? Pay for the affordable units off the rents, the market projects, and make the project work.
Like in Santa Monica, right?
Yeah.
So before I go to slide, yeah, others who want to ask questions?
So I'm probably fairly naive on all this, but I did talk to that Abeling bloke at Todco, and he poses as this fantastic progressive around housing. I mean, this is his motivation and everything. So what is in his mind in challenging the Stevenson project, knowing that if he doesn't get what he's aiming for, then nothing will happen at all?
Well,
I mean, what's his calculation?
I think there's an ideology in some quarters that the only housing that is good housing is housing that is deed restricted affordable, and all other housing is a form of pollution. Basically, it brings undesirable gentrifiers into into neighborhoods where they don't belong, or so for some people, I think nothing is the best solution. And but I don't know to what extent that is a true, like, sincerely held belief, and to what extent it's just opportunistic. But I will say that I've been working on this project with a couple of political scientists on public opinion, public understanding of housing markets. And there is like a large share of the public that believes that even like large expansions of the supply of housing in response to the loosening of development restrictions would cause the price of existing homes to go up. Like 30 to 40% of the public believes that even a large, like 10% increase in the regional supply of housing cause prices and rents for existing homes to be higher than they are today. Yeah. It would go the other way. Yes. But what I'm saying is I mean, I'm happy to attribute bad faith in the narrow sense of like trying to avoid their legal obligations to the Board of Supervisors. I think that was very clear in the case of the Stevenson project. But in terms of like what John Elberling believes in his heart of hearts, like is he not sincere? I have no reason to think he's not sincere. I just think that like there's people of all kinds of ideas in this world, right? And some of them, some people sincerely believe that vaccines are going to kill you, right? But what do you do about that other than hope that their views remain a minority?
Hi, Chris. Thank you so much for speaking. I'm not sure if you have the answer to this, but I'll try and ask this question. You probably have heard this question before. You talked about California always being expensive. The cost of living in California actually didn't go up until the redlining and gentrification that started happening nationwide in the 30s and 40s. And the cost of living went even up more in California, forcing a lot of the Black families out. And in 1968, when the Fair Housing Act was supposed to allegedly stop redlining, it didn't. In fact, when Governor Ronald Reagan, many things that he did wrong, he actually was for the redlining and gentrification. My question is even though that act went through in 1968, how do people like Governor Ronald Reagan get by with doing what he did?
Oh boy, that is a great question. So I don't actually know. I'd be really interested if you've got data on California housing prices like pre-World War II. Like that would be super interesting to me. Like why did the Fair Housing Act not work? So the Fair Housing Act does a couple things, right? It's a federal law passed in 1968. It prohibits discrimination with respect to race and a couple other categories in like selection of tenants and advertising of real estate and sale of real estate. I think the Fair Housing Act is generally considered to have made a pretty big difference in like how real estate brokers conduct their business, right? So steering, which is like trying to move people to like neighborhoods where other people like them, like that practice was widespread. I don't think it's so widespread today. Real estate brokers like are very cautious in their advertising. They don't include references to like, near a synagogue, right? Which could be, construed as expressing a preference on the basis of religion, that sort of thing. So I think there have been some good things that came out of the Fair Housing Act. What did not come out of the Fair Housing Act was zoning reform. Attacks on exclusionary zoning. There have been very, very, very few successful challenges to zoning under the FHA. And part of that is due to the fact that there was a big push initially to use federal funding to incentivize cities to eliminate their exclusionary zoning practices in suburbs. And it was led by Mitt Romney's father, who was the former governor of Michigan and then became Richard Nixon's Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. And Elder Romney was a big fan of desegregation. He wanted to make it work. But once he put his plan out there was massive backlash, and Nixon told him to can it, and he canned it. And I don't know if he ultimately resigned, but it went nowhere. And then like, this is at the same time, there was the backlash against busing, and the federal government administratively basically gave up at that point, which is like early 1970s. And Obama tried in a really incremental way to push a little further on fair housing. But to be honest, like the affirmatively furthering fair housing mandate of the California legislature, which is now maybe going to be enforced a little bit through the housing element law. This is the first try, like anywhere in the nation, to do desegregation through zoning reform since 1972.
Thanks. So first of all, I have your numbers. It's so the average build rate units per year in California is about 100,000. Sometimes a little over, like up between 100,000 and 110. So what we did was we looked at CEQA petitions from 2020 and counted the total number of units that those petitions challenged, and it was 48,000. So it's, you know, it's a little bit apples and oranges, but that's about half. And I have a question too. Could you talk a little bit about why you think AB 2656 stalled in committee in a year when so many more high-profile bills got through? Because it seems like it's normally the other way around, where the high-profile bills flame out in these titanic floor battles, but the sneaky kind of mechanical things get through. And you think it's going to get through?
So Michael should answer those
Yeah, sorry,
questions.
Yeah, good question. So it was very challenging. Even though we were avoiding the CEQA statute, we were amending, you know, as you know, the government code intentionally, I think, because of just the difficult politics. Even so, that bill is what we call triple referred, which is the most number of committees you can get a bill referred to. And so the environmental, committee was involved, the judiciary committee, in addition to local government and housing, they all had a say in how it proceeded. Even so, because Assemblyman Merting is a high profile author, we were able to get the bill through all the policy committees and off the floor with very strong votes in the Assembly. And then also on the Senate side, although it took a lot of negotiations, particularly with local government, we spent weeks going back and forth with the representatives and the attorneys for the League of California Cities and the counties, et cetera, because they do feel like they're in a bind and they want to, the point was to try to reduce the potential for litigation, not expand it. If we can do that, because that also drives costs, which in the Appropriations Committee looks at as well. Are we clogging up the courts with additional litigation, in these areas? The other challenge of the dynamic was really with AB 2011. That was such a high profile bill and there were so many co-authors on it. And as you know, that had been a multi-year effort as well. All the oxygen was taken out of the room, particularly around the negotiations. If you track those, and the SB6 was the other one on the Senate side, between what the carpenter's language was around labor standards and what the building trades were looking for. And that was a huge negotiation, big fights. And I think there just wasn't additional appetite by that point because the trades actually were the main opposition to the Ting bill. And I think there was a sense that they were going to give them something in this session, even though that's kind of crummy that's the way it came out, even though they got the language they wanted in SB6. And so we've already actually met with Senator Portantino, who chairs the Appropriations Committee, and talked to him about that. And we're trying to explain that under our bill, the trade still could sue. We didn't take away any rights or responsibilities either for developers or other parties who want to challenge a CEQA, certification. And so we do hope to be able to come back. We've got that negotiation out of the way now. We know more or less what the bill should look like, but we just have a lot of CEQA purists. And I think there were even a few smaller environmental groups that were trying to give the trades cover at the very end. But I think it's notable that the Sierra Club, for example, did not take a position on the bill because they understood what we were trying to do, as did NRDC, another major environmental group in the Capitol. So I think there is hope because, and particularly now that it's focused really on those infill sites using the CEQA definition. I think there is a path there, but it's never easy in this space.
I'll just note parenthetically that it's kind of weird that you run an infill housing bill and you define infill in the most narrow way that it's defined anywhere in California state law, that the best you can get from mainstream environmental groups is we'll stay on the sidelines with our mouth shut. I mean, it's messed up. Hey, Tim.
Hey, Chris.
So you alluded to the poli-sci, the paper you wrote with some political scientists about sort of folk wisdom about supply. And you made a reference like 30% of people believe this, and like, what do you do with it? Do you have a little bit more to say about that? What do we do like for the people that aren't in this room, that aren't sort of enthusiasts, how to like talk in a sort of canned way if you can't show them the PowerPoint presentation about HA and CEQA?
So I hope to have an answer to that question in 6 months to a year, because we're doing some we're doing some experiments that are trying to get at exactly this question about like where do people's ideas come from and like how do they change. But I don't have any answers now, other than to say, like, we did a bunch of things that we thought would help us understand like what kinds of mental models people subscribe to, and how that correlates with what they believe about the effects of housing supply shock on housing prices and rents. And basically those models were useless. And yet at the same time, we thought maybe this is just like survey noise and people don't really mean what they're saying. And like, but we did a bunch of tests that indicate that it's not that either. So the bottom line is there seems to be a lot of people, at least on a survey, will say that they really believe that more new housing means existing housing becoming more expensive.
Hi, Chris. The woman's question over there made me think about Article 34, and I'm wondering what interplay there is between Article 34 and HAA, and if you think the upcoming potential repeal of that will have any additional impacts in that affordable housing supply.
So Article 34 is one of the great racist provisions of the California Constitution. Prop 13 probably belongs in the same category, but maybe not. I don't know. Maybe not in effect, if not intent. But Article 34 made it impossible for a city to build public housing unless the housing project was approved in a referendum vote. It's a great example of direct democracy run riot in a way that was clearly designed to keep Black people from living in certain communities or certain places in certain communities. And there is now the legislature is proposing an Article 34 repeal constitutional amendment, and I hope and expect that will pass, but who knows? Like, I mean, there's certain things that within kind of elite liberal circles are just accepted as obviously and axiomatically right, like public housing is good and affirmative action is good. But when the California electorate was asked to say whether they thought affirmative action was good, 2 years ago, the electorate was like, no, we're liberal, but we're not that kind of liberal. So I don't actually know what will happen with the Article 34 vote. No, it can't overrule it because Article 34 is in the Constitution. So the Constitution is higher law than whatever's in a statute the legislature passes. Yeah, we've done. There are some kinds of workarounds.
So we'll pick up one more, and then we'll go to a lightning round here on Slido.
Wonderful. I'm lucky. I have this nagging thought, and it might be again one of these myths that I don't know that I don't know is false yet. I'm just thinking. I read something like 40,000 units of housing in San Francisco are more or less long-term vacant, and it's making me think, among the variety of things that cause our housing prices to increase, is it something about the way that vacant units just are held as vacant? In some ways, like we know, like a vacant storefront sometimes is worth more dead than alive. Housing units, are they worth more dead than alive? In a lot, like obviously, I've tried to buy a building here. I've tried to buy a house here. The realtor literally tells me how to illegally evict my tenants, and I'm just there for the open house. Okay.
So I'm going to kick this question to Michael because SPUR did some work on vacancy rates in San Francisco.
Anyway, I guess that was my question. Like, it's part of it that, we can build housing as long as it's like, but if if a condo building is like all sold and half empty, what good is it doing? Anyway.
Yeah, we do have, my colleague Sarah Karlinski did some work on this on the website. We have a report that she had produced on that. And I think she thinks it's overstated by about twice with that 40,000 number. And then there's also, so there's a lag between, you know, when an apartment is sold or leased up, et cetera, and, you know, when it's taken off the market. So take a look at that for more on.
But we did pass a
vacancy.
vacancy tax,
Yeah, there's
and
a
we'll see what that does.
So we're almost coming to the end of our. So we're almost coming to the end of our time. I just wanted to see if I could catch a few quick answers from Chris. Would that be okay? Precious, do we have time to do that, or? Yeah, Slido questions. Could I do that? Yeah, kind of a lightning round. And so we'll ask for compressed answers
Okay.
from Chris too,
Lightning answers.
which I know is a challenge for a professor. So quickly, what's the story with the CEQA time limits and why aren't they enforced?
Because they're not enforced because the legislature failed to say how they were supposed to be enforced. And because the legislature didn't say that, the courts were like, well,
So vagueness.
not vagueness. It's just like, there's not a remedy that's specifically provided for.
And then people hear about categorical exemptions to CEQA and how can these be used by developers and what are the limitations?
So categorical exemptions are exemptions that are created administratively through what are called the CEQA guidelines. And there's a categorical exemption for infill projects that in theory can work in a lot of contexts. But the problem is that if the city doesn't want to issue the exemption, there's not a legal mechanism to make the city issue the exemption.
And it seems that CEQA became Todco's tool for what was a conflict over housing resource provision based on class and not environment, for example. Does the HA address the class of housing, affordable versus market rate, et cetera?
There are special additional provisions like the builder's remedy that apply just to affordable projects, but the basic provisions that I reviewed in the talk apply to all housing projects.
And does the environmental impact study include global climate impact or is it limited to the local environment?
So the focus is effects on the local environment, but greenhouse gas emissions are one of the things that are considered.
Great. Well, I think we've basically run out of time. We're very grateful for all of you to be here tonight and for Manny's for hosting us.